I was charging my daughter-in-law's phone when the text message lit up the screen. Act concerned until she dies, then we're free. The sender? My own son, Trevor. The subject of their casual murder plot? Me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My hands trembled as I stared at those 8 words that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. Here I was, standing in the kitchen of their beautiful Maplewood Heights home, making Sunday dinner like the loving grandmother I'd always tried to be, while they were literally planning my death through text messages. The phone was still buzzing with incoming messages, and against every instinct that told me to look away, I couldn't stop reading. Trevor's texts painted a picture so cold, so calculated, that I had to grip the granite countertop to keep from collapsing. "Mom's getting too suspicious about the inheritance paperwork," he'd written. "Vanessa thinks we need to speed things up before she figures out what we've been doing." Vanessa, my sweet daughter-in-law who'd been bringing me homemade soup when I felt under the weather, the woman who'd insisted on driving me to my doctor's appointments because she was so concerned about my health. The one who'd convinced me to update my will 6 months ago, supposedly to make sure everything was properly organized for my golden years. My name is Eleanor Hartfield, and until that moment, I thought I was a lucky 71-year-old widow living comfortably in the small town of Riverside Valley. I'd raised Trevor as a single mother after his father died in a construction accident when Trevor was just 12. I'd worked 3 jobs to put him through college, sacrificed my own dreams to ensure he had every opportunity I'd never gotten. And this was how he repaid that love, by plotting my murder with his wife so they could inherit my modest estate. The kitchen around me suddenly felt like a crime scene. Every concerned gesture from Vanessa over the past months now took on a sinister meaning. The way she'd insisted on handling my medications when I'd gotten confused about the dosage. How she'd encouraged me to stop seeing certain friends because they were too negative for my mental health. The concerned frown when she'd suggested I might want to consider moving to assisted living because living alone was getting dangerous at my age. I forced myself to keep reading, even though each message felt like a knife twisting in my chest. They'd been planning this for almost a year, carefully documenting my declining mental state and increasing confusion to build a case for why my eventual death would seem natural. Vanessa had been gradually increasing something in my evening tea, the special blend she'd brought me from that fancy shop downtown, the one she insisted would help me sleep better. The insurance investigator won't look too closely at a 71-year-old woman with documented cognitive decline, Vanessa had texted, especially with Trevor being such a devoted son, taking care of all her affairs. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't just planning to kill me. They'd been slowly poisoning me for months while playing the role of concerned family members. The dizzy spells I'd been having, the memory lapses that had worried me so much I'd almost gone to see a neurologist, the increasing fatigue that made me rely on them more and more. It hadn't been aging. It had been attempted murder, disguised as loving care. But here's what Trevor and Vanessa hadn't counted on when they started their little game. I wasn't just some helpless old woman they could manipulate and discard. I was Eleanor Hartfield, a woman who'd survived poverty, single motherhood, and more workplace discrimination than either of them could imagine. I'd built a successful catering business from nothing, put myself through night school to get my business degree, and raised a son who'd become an engineer, though clearly not the man I'd hoped he'd become. And now, standing in their kitchen with their murder plot literally in my hands, I realized that my real education was just beginning. Because while they'd been planning my death, I was about to plan their complete and total destruction. The front door opened and I heard Trevor's voice calling out, "Mom, you here? Vanessa said you were making dinner." His tone was warm, affectionate, the same voice that had been coordinating my murder just minutes earlier through text messages. I quickly placed Vanessa's phone back on the charger exactly where I'd found it, my mind racing through everything I'd just discovered. They expected to find a confused, trusting old woman making them a family meal. Instead, they were about to sit down to dinner with someone who now knew exactly what kind of monsters they really were. "In the kitchen, sweetie," I called back, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Years of running a business had taught me how to maintain composure under pressure, and I was going to need every bit of that skill for what was coming next. As I heard their footsteps approaching, I made a decision that would change all our lives forever. Trevor and Vanessa wanted to play a game where they pretended to care about me while planning my death. Fine, I could play games too. But my game was going to have very different rules, and very different winners. They thought they were hunting a helpless old woman. They were about to discover they'd awakened something much more dangerous. A mother's fury combined with a businesswoman's cunning and a survivor's refusal to go quietly into the night. The war was about to begin, and they didn't even know it yet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The family dinner that night was the most surreal experience of my life. There I sat, passing mashed potatoes and listening to Trevor tell me about his promotion at Steinberg Engineering, while Vanessa poured my special tea with the same caring smile she'd been wearing for months. Every gesture, every concerned look, every loving word was revealed as performance art designed to cover up their systematic attempt to murder me. "You look tired, Mom," Trevor said, reaching over to pat my hand with what I now recognized as rehearsed affection. "Are you sleeping okay? Vanessa mentioned you've been having those dizzy spells again." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the tea in his face and demand to know how he could sit there pretending to love me while slowly poisoning me to death. Instead, I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the confused elderly mother they expected to see. "Oh, you know how it is at my age," I said, my voice carrying just the right hint of frailty. "Some days are better than others." Vanessa leaned forward with practiced concern, her auburn hair catching the dining room light as she spoke in that honey-sweet voice I now knew concealed pure evil. "Eleanor, I've been thinking we should really consider getting you a full medical workup. These symptoms you've been having, well, it's better to be safe than sorry." The audacity of it took my breath away. She was suggesting medical tests to document the very symptoms she'd been causing with whatever poison she'd been slipping into my tea. They weren't just planning to kill me, they were building a medical paper trail to make my eventual death look like natural causes brought on by age-related decline. "That's so thoughtful of you both," I managed to say, taking a small sip of the tea that I now knew contained something designed to harm me. The bitter aftertaste I'd attributed to the unusual herbs now made perfect sense. I don't know what I'd do without such caring family. Trevor beamed at me with the same smile he'd had as a little boy when I'd praised his school projects. The same face that had looked up at me with complete trust when I'd worked those 3 jobs to keep us afloat after his father died. Now that face belonged to a man who was counting down the days until my death would make him wealthy. After dinner, as I insisted on helping with the dishes despite their protests that I should rest, I managed to sneak another look at Vanessa's phone when she stepped outside to take a call. What I found made my blood freeze in my veins. They had spreadsheets, actual Excel files tracking my symptoms, my behavior changes, and something called dosage schedules. Trevor, with his engineering precision, had been documenting my decline like a scientific experiment. The notes were clinical, detached, discussing the best ways to avoid suspicion while gradually increasing whatever they were giving me. But worse than the spreadsheets were the photos, pictures of me looking confused or tired, taken without my knowledge over the past several months. Images that would perfectly support their narrative of a woman suffering from cognitive decline. They'd been building evidence of my supposed mental deterioration while simultaneously causing it. The final nail in the coffin of my naive trust came in the form of email correspondence with a life insurance company. 6 months ago, Vanessa had convinced me to increase my life insurance policy, supposedly to ensure Trevor would be, quote, properly taken care of if something happened to me. What I discovered was that the policy was worth $750,000, and Trevor had been in contact with the insurance company asking detailed questions about the claims process and what documentation would be required in the event of my death. They weren't just planning to kill me. They'd turned my murder into a business plan with financial projections and timeline estimates. The scope of their betrayal was staggering. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of greed that had gotten out of hand. This was a calculated, long-term conspiracy that had been in motion for almost a year. They'd researched poisons, studied insurance policies, documented fake symptoms, and planned every detail of how they'd present themselves as grieving family members after my convenient death. As I sat in my car in their driveway, trying to process what I'd learned, my phone rang. It was Dr. Patricia Whitmore, my longtime physician, returning a call I'd made earlier in the week about my increasing health concerns. "Eleanor, I got your message about the dizziness and memory issues," she said, her voice warm with genuine concern that stood in stark contrast to the fake worry I'd been receiving from my own family. "I think we should schedule you for some comprehensive tests. These symptoms could indicate anything from medication interactions to early signs of neurological changes." "Dr. Whitmore," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If someone were being slowly poisoned, what kind of symptoms might they experience?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Eleanor, that's a very specific question. Are you concerned that someone might be harming you?" I looked back at the house where my son and his wife were probably congratulating themselves on another successful evening of playing concerned family members while plotting my death. The warm light spilling from their windows should have felt welcoming. Instead, it looked like the glow from a trap designed to lure me to my destruction. "Dr. Whitmore," I said, making a decision that would change everything, "I think someone is trying to kill me, and I think I know who." The silence that followed felt like the calm before a storm. When Dr. Whitmore spoke again, her voice had shifted from casual concern to professional urgency. "Eleanor, I need you to come to my office first thing tomorrow morning. Don't eat or drink anything that anyone else has prepared, and bring samples of any medications or supplements you've been taking. If what you're suggesting is true, we need to act quickly to protect your health and document what's been done to you." As I hung up the phone and drove home to my small house on Elm Street, I realized that this phone call had marked the end of one phase of my life and the beginning of another. For months, I'd been the unwitting victim of an elaborate murder plot, but starting tomorrow, I was going to become something Trevor and Vanessa had never anticipated, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. They thought they were going to inherit my money after staging my convenient death. Instead, they were about to discover that the elderly woman they'd been systematically poisoning had just declared war on them. And unlike their cowardly attack from the shadows, my war was going to be fought in the bright light of truth, with every weapon the law could provide. The game had changed, and they didn't even know it yet. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my living room surrounded by photo albums and documents, trying to understand how the sweet little boy I'd raised had become a man capable of planning my murder. The house felt different now, not like the safe haven I'd worked so hard to create, but like a crime scene where I'd been slowly dying without even knowing it. My name is Eleanor May Hartfield, born Eleanor May Thompson in the coal mining town of Millbrook Valley, West Virginia, in 1952. I learned early that life doesn't hand you anything on a silver platter, and that if you want to survive, you better develop some steel in your spine. My father worked the mines until black lung took him when I was 16. My mother cleaned houses for the wealthy families up on Prospect Hill until arthritis crippled her hands. I was the third of 5 children, and when Daddy died, I became the family's primary breadwinner overnight. While other girls my age were worried about prom dresses and football games, I was working at Morrison's 5 and dime after school and weekends, bringing home every penny to keep my family from losing our little house on Copper Street. I learned to stretch $1 until it screamed, to make meals from whatever was on sale, and to fix things myself because we couldn't afford to hire someone else to do it. At 18, I married Robert Hartfield, a kind man 5 years older who worked construction and promised me a life away from the economic desperation of Millbrook Valley. We moved to Riverside Valley, where Robert had lined up a job with Henderson Construction Company, and for a brief, shining moment, I thought I'd escaped the financial struggles that had defined my childhood. Trevor was born in 1975, when I was 23 and still naive enough to believe that hard work and love were enough to guarantee a good life. Robert adored that baby, would spend hours just holding him, talking to him about all the things they'd do together when Trevor got older. He was going to teach him to fish, to work with his hands, to be the kind of man who kept his word and took care of his family. Those dreams died on a rainy Tuesday morning in October 1987 when Robert fell from a scaffolding at a construction site on Maple Avenue. The safety harness failed. A lawsuit later revealed the construction company had been using substandard equipment to save money, and my husband died instantly, leaving me with a 12-year-old son and a mortgage I had no way to pay. The life insurance payout was pathetic, barely enough to cover the funeral expenses and a few months of bills. Robert's employer fought the wrongful death claim for 3 years, and by the time we finally received a settlement, most of it went to the lawyers who'd handled the case. I was left with exactly $47,000, and the realization that I was completely on my own in raising my son. That's when I discovered what I was really made of. I took a job at Riverside Valley Community Hospital, working the night shift in the kitchen, cleaning dishes and preparing food trays. The hours were brutal, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., but it meant I could be home when Trevor got back from school and help him with his homework before catching a few hours of sleep. On weekends, I cleaned houses for families in the affluent Willowbrook neighborhood. The same kind of work my mother had done, scrubbing toilets and dusting furniture for people who barely acknowledged my existence. But those weren't the only jobs. During Trevor's school hours, I worked part-time at Pemberton's flower shop, learning the business side of retail while arranging bouquets and helping customers plan weddings and funerals. Mrs. Helen Pemberton, the owner, was a tough woman in her 60s who'd built her business from nothing after her own husband died young. She became something of a mentor to me, teaching me about inventory management, customer service, and the fine art of making every penny count. "Eleanor," she'd say as she watched me work, "you've got something most people don't have. You understand that success isn't about what happens to you. It's about what you do with what happens to you. Don't let this tragedy define your limits. Let it define your strength." Those words carried me through the exhaustion, through the nights when I'd fall asleep at Trevor's baseball games because I'd been working for 18 hours straight, through the humiliation of using food stamps while serving dinner to hospital patients whose families probably spent more on a single meal than I made in a week. By the time Trevor was in high school, I'd managed to scrape together enough money to start taking night classes at Riverside Valley Community College. Business administration, accounting, marketing, anything that might help me build something better than barely surviving paycheck to paycheck. I studied at the kitchen table after Trevor went to bed, often falling asleep over textbooks, and waking up with my face pressed against pages about profit margins and cash flow analysis. Trevor was an excellent student, which was both a blessing and a financial terror. His grades were good enough for a full scholarship to State University, but the living expenses and additional costs were still more than I could easily manage. I took out loans I wasn't sure I could repay, sold my mother's engagement ring, the only valuable thing I owned, and worked extra shifts whenever they were available. When Trevor graduated with his engineering degree in 1997, I thought I'd accomplished something miraculous. I'd taken a grieving 12-year-old boy and somehow managed to get him through college without either of us starving or ending up homeless. At his graduation ceremony, he hugged me and whispered, "Mom, I'm going to take care of you now. You'll never have to work so hard again." I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. Using the business skills I'd learned at night school and the customer service experience from all those years of part-time jobs, I started Hartfield Catering in 1998. It began with serving small church functions and birthday parties, working out of my home kitchen and using equipment I'd bought secondhand or on clearance. But my food was good. I'd learned to cook creatively during all those years of stretching grocery budgets, and my service was reliable because I understood that other people's special occasions mattered. The business grew slowly but steadily. Within 5 years, I was catering weddings, corporate events, and anniversary parties throughout the county. I hired my first employee in 2003, bought my first commercial van in 2004, and by 2010, Hartfield Catering was successful enough that I was able to pay off my house and start building actual savings for the first time in my life. Trevor had found good work with Steinberg Engineering, married Vanessa in 2018, and seemed to be building the stable, successful life I'd always dreamed he'd have. When he'd call to check on me, ask about the business, or invite me to dinner, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing your sacrifices had been worthwhile. I thought I'd raised a man who understood the value of family, who remembered what it was like to struggle, who would never take advantage of someone who couldn't protect themselves. I thought the boy who used to help me count change for the grocery store had grown into someone with the same principles I'd tried to instill in him through years of example and hard work. Now sitting in my living room at 3 a.m, looking at photos of Trevor's childhood while processing the reality that he was planning to murder me for money, I realized that somewhere along the way I'd failed completely. Not as a provider, not as a supporter of his education and opportunities, but as a teacher of basic human decency. The sweet little boy in these pictures had grown into a monster, and somehow, despite all my efforts to raise him right, I'd created someone capable of viewing his own mother as an obstacle to be eliminated. But here's what Trevor had forgotten about his mother during his transformation into a calculating killer. I hadn't survived poverty, single parenthood, and decades of back-breaking work by being weak or giving up when things got difficult. I'd built a successful business from nothing, earned a college degree while working 3 jobs, and turned a $47,000 life insurance settlement into a comfortable retirement. If Trevor thought he could outsmart the woman who'd taught him everything he knew about persistence and strategy, he was about to learn just how much he'd underestimated his target. Vanessa Lynn Caldwell entered our lives in the spring of 2016 like a perfectly orchestrated performance. Trevor brought her to my house for Sunday dinner, and I'll never forget my first impression of her. Tall, elegant, with honey blonde hair styled in a way that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. She wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater and designer jeans that looked casual but screamed expensive, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. "Mrs. Hartfield," she said, extending a manicured hand with a smile that was just a little too perfect. "Trevor has told me so much about you. I've been dying to meet the amazing woman who raised such a wonderful man." Even then, something about her felt rehearsed. The compliments came too easily, the interest seemed too calculated, and there was a way she looked around my modest living room that reminded me of the wealthy women whose houses I'd cleaned years earlier. Not quite disapproval, but a kind of mental cataloging that made me feel like she was appraising everything I owned. Vanessa worked as a financial advisor at Pemberton & Associates, the same investment firm that handled the retirement accounts for several of my catering clients. She had a bachelor's degree in finance from Davidson College and spoke knowledgeably about market trends and investment strategies. When she learned about my catering business, she asked all the right questions about profit margins and growth potential, impressing me with her business acumen. "You've built something really impressive here, Mrs. Hartfield," she said as she helped me clear the dinner table. "Most small businesses fail within the first 5 years, but you've been thriving for almost 2 decades. That takes real skill." I was flattered by her attention and her apparent respect for my accomplishments. After years of being dismissed by people who saw me as just another working-class widow, it felt good to have someone with Vanessa's education and background acknowledge what I'd achieved. But there were small things that bothered me, details that seemed insignificant at the time but took on darker meaning later. The way she'd ask pointed questions about my financial situation while framing them as concern for my retirement planning. How she'd suggest that I should simplify my life by consolidating my various bank accounts and investment portfolios. The subtle comments about how exhausting it must be to run a business at my age, and whether I'd considered selling while the market was good. "Trevor worries about you working so hard," she'd say with that practiced concern in her voice. "Maybe it's time to think about slowing down, enjoying the fruits of all your labor." The first real red flag came about 6 months into their relationship, during Thanksgiving dinner at my house. I'd invited several longtime friends and their families, people who'd known Trevor since he was a child and had watched him grow up. Vanessa was charming with everyone, asking about their careers and families, but I noticed she was particularly interested in conversations about inheritance and estate planning. When my friend Dorothy Kellerman mentioned that her late husband had left her a substantial life insurance policy, Vanessa immediately engaged her in a detailed discussion about how she'd managed the payout and whether she'd had any problems with the insurance company. She asked about probate proceedings, about how long it had taken to settle the estate, about what kind of documentation had been required. "It's so important to have everything properly organized," Vanessa said. "The last thing grieving family members need is to deal with complicated financial matters when they're trying to process their loss." At the time, I thought she was just making conversation, perhaps drawing on her professional knowledge to be helpful. Looking back, I realized she was conducting research, gathering information about how life insurance claims were processed and what would trigger additional scrutiny from insurance companies. The second red flag was subtler but more personal. Trevor had always been close to his childhood friends, particularly Jake Morrison and Danny Chen, boys he'd grown up with who'd remained loyal friends through college and into their adult years. They'd gather at my house for football games, help with household projects when I needed assistance, and generally maintain the kind of friendships I'd always hoped Trevor would value. Vanessa began systematically undermining these relationships. She'd make comments about how Jake's drinking seemed excessive, how Danny's job at the post office suggested a lack of ambition, how their conversations were too focused on the past rather than building toward the future. She'd schedule conflicting social events whenever Trevor had plans with his old friends, creating situations where he had to choose between his longtime friendships and his new relationship. "Trevor, you're an engineer with a bright future," she'd say. "Don't you think it's time to cultivate relationships with people who share your professional aspirations? Jake and Danny are sweet, but they're not exactly going to help advance your career." Gradually, Trevor began spending less time with friends who'd known him before Vanessa and more time with her social circle, young professionals from her firm, couples who lived in the exclusive Willowbrook neighborhood, people who measured success by material possessions and social status rather than character and loyalty. The third red flag was her relationship with money, particularly my money. Vanessa would often suggest financial strategies that seemed designed to give her greater insight into my assets and financial planning. She recommended that I switch to her investment firm, arguing that she could provide better service because she understood my family situation. She offered to help me organize my financial records, claiming her professional expertise would help me maximize my retirement security. "Mrs. Hartfield, I hate to see you missing opportunities because your investments aren't properly diversified," she'd say during our Sunday dinners. "Let me at least review your portfolio and see if there are any obvious improvements we could make." When I politely declined, explaining that I was comfortable with my current financial advisor, she'd persist with gentle pressure disguised as concern. She'd bring up articles about seniors being taken advantage of by unscrupulous financial advisors, or mention cases she'd heard about where elderly people had lost their savings due to poor investment advice. The fourth red flag was how she began positioning herself as my primary caretaker, even though I didn't need one. She'd call several times a week to check on me, asking about my health, my daily activities, whether I was eating properly or getting enough rest. She'd offer to accompany me to doctor's appointments, saying it was important to have someone there to help remember what the doctor said. "At your age, Mrs. Hartfield, it's so easy to forget important medical information," she'd say with that concerned smile I was beginning to recognize as her signature expression. "I just want to make sure you're getting the best possible care." She began bringing me gifts that seemed thoughtful but served her purposes, a special tea blend that would help with my energy levels, vitamin supplements that she insisted were better than what I was currently taking, herbal remedies that would support my overall wellness. Each gift came with detailed instructions about when and how to use them, and she'd follow up to make sure I was taking them regularly. The most troubling red flag was how she began creating documentation of my supposed declining health. She'd take photos during family gatherings when I looked tired or wasn't feeling well, always framing them as loving family memories. She'd make casual comments to Trevor about how I seemed more forgetful lately, how I appeared to be losing weight, how she was concerned about my ability to live alone safely. "I love your mother dearly," I overheard her telling Trevor one evening when they thought I was in the bathroom, "but I'm worried about her." She seemed confused about what day it was when I called yesterday, and she forgot that she'd already told me about Mrs. Patterson's surgery. Maybe we should start thinking about getting her some additional support. By the time Trevor proposed to Vanessa in December 2017, she had successfully positioned herself as the caring daughter-in-law who was looking out for everyone's best interests. She'd isolated Trevor from his oldest friends, gained detailed knowledge of my financial situation, established herself as my unofficial health advocate, and begun building a narrative about my declining mental capacity. Looking back now, I can see that Vanessa's entire relationship with our family was a calculated long-term strategy. She'd identified Trevor as someone with expectations of inheritance, researched the most effective ways to accelerate that timeline, and systematically put the pieces in place for what would eventually become their murder plot. But what Vanessa had never anticipated was that the elderly woman she'd been studying and manipulating for over a year was also studying her. And while she'd been building her case for why my death would seem natural and expected, I'd been unconsciously cataloging all the ways her concern felt artificial, and her motives felt wrong. She'd played a long game with incredible patience and attention to detail, but she'd made one crucial error in her calculations. She'd underestimated the intelligence and observational skills of her intended victim. The same business instincts that had helped me build a successful catering company from nothing were now going to help me destroy the woman who'd spent 2 years planning my murder. The wedding in June 2018 was everything Vanessa had dreamed of and everything I'd learned to dread. Held at the prestigious Riverside Country Club, with over 200 guests and enough flowers to stock my old employer's shop for a month, it was a celebration that cost more than I'd made in my first 5 years of running my catering business. Vanessa's parents, Richard and Catherine Caldwell, spared no expense in creating what the local newspaper called the social event of the season. What struck me most about that day wasn't the luxury or the pageantry, but how Vanessa used the wedding as an opportunity to further position herself as my advocate and protector. During the reception, she made a point of introducing me to her family and friends as the most amazing mother-in-law in the world, always with her hand on my arm in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt possessive. "Eleanor has been like a second mother to me," she told her college roommate, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "I just want to make sure she's properly taken care of as she gets older. She's worked so hard all her life, and now it's time for family to step up and look after her." I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the grateful mother-in-law, but something about the way she spoke about me in the past tense made my skin crawl. It was as if she'd already written the ending to my story and was just waiting for the right time to implement it. The honeymoon period after their wedding was when Vanessa's manipulation became more systematic and sophisticated. She and Trevor moved into a beautiful colonial house on Sycamore Drive in the Willowbrook neighborhood. Complete with a 3-car garage and enough space for the family she claimed they were planning to start. The mortgage payments alone were more than most people made in a month, but Trevor's promotion at Steinberg Engineering and Vanessa's success at Pemberton and Associates made it financially feasible. Almost immediately after they settled into their new home, Vanessa began what she called family integration activities. She insisted that I join them for dinner every Sunday, claiming it was important to maintain close family bonds now that we were all getting older. She'd cook elaborate meals, always making sure to prepare my special tea with the herbal blend she'd brought back from their honeymoon in Thailand. "This tea is incredible, Mrs. Hartfield," she'd say as she served it in the delicate china cups she'd received as wedding gifts. "The herbalist in Bangkok said it was specifically formulated for older women to help with energy and mental clarity. I bought several pounds of it just for you." The tea had an unusual taste, slightly bitter with an aftertaste that lingered longer than I expected. But Vanessa was so enthusiastic about its supposed health benefits that I didn't want to seem ungrateful by refusing to drink it. She'd watch carefully to make sure I finished the entire cup, always ready with encouraging comments about how much better I'd feel once the herbs had time to work in my system. Within a few weeks of these regular Sunday dinners, I began experiencing symptoms that I attributed to the normal aging process. I'd feel dizzy when I stood up too quickly, have trouble remembering details about recent conversations, and find myself more tired than usual after what should have been routine activities. My handwriting became less steady, and I'd occasionally struggle to find the right words when I was talking to customers about catering arrangements. Vanessa noticed these changes immediately and responded with increasing levels of concern that felt both touching and intrusive. She'd call me several times during the week to check on my health, asking detailed questions about my symptoms and suggesting that we should start keeping a written record of any changes in my condition. "Mrs. Hartfield, I've been reading about cognitive changes in older adults," she said during one of these calls, "and early documentation is so important for getting proper medical care. Would you mind if I helped you keep track of these episodes? Just as a precaution." She created what she called a wellness journal, a leather-bound notebook where she'd record my symptoms, my medication schedule, and her observations about my daily activities. She'd bring it to our Sunday dinners and review the previous week's entries, asking me to confirm details and add anything I might have forgotten to mention. The journal entries painted a picture of gradual but consistent decline. Eleanor seemed confused about what day her doctor's appointment was scheduled. Eleanor appeared to have difficulty following the conversation during dinner. Eleanor forgot that she'd already told this story about Mrs. Patterson's surgery. Each entry was dated and detailed, creating what looked like medical documentation of my deteriorating mental state. At the same time, Vanessa began inserting herself more deeply into my financial affairs. She'd offer to help me organize my business records, claiming that her professional expertise could help me identify tax deductions I might be missing. She'd suggest strategies for maximizing my retirement savings, always framing her advice in terms of protecting my future security. "Mrs. Hartfield, I hate to see you working so hard when you should be enjoying your golden years," she'd say, as she reviewed my catering contracts and invoices. "Have you ever considered what your exit strategy might be? Building a business is wonderful, but knowing when and how to step back is equally important." Her questions became increasingly specific. How much was the business worth? What kind of life insurance did I carry? Had I updated my will recently? Were my beneficiaries clearly designated on all my accounts? She'd present these inquiries as natural concerns for someone who cared about my well-being, but I began to feel like I was being interviewed rather than helped. The most insidious aspect of Vanessa's manipulation was how she began undermining my confidence in my own judgment. When I'd express concern about my increasing forgetfulness or mention that I was worried about my health, she'd respond with a mixture of sympathy and subtle suggestions that maybe I wasn't thinking as clearly as I used to. "Oh, Eleanor, you're being too hard on yourself," she'd say with that practiced smile. "It's perfectly natural to have some memory issues at your age. The important thing is that you have family who can help you make good decisions when things get confusing. She'd accompany me to doctor's appointments, always positioning herself as the helpful daughter-in-law who was there to provide support and ensure I understood my medical care properly. She'd take notes during these visits, ask follow-up questions, and volunteer information about my symptoms that I hadn't mentioned or hadn't thought were significant. Dr. Whitmore, I've been keeping track of Eleanor's symptoms, and I'm concerned about the pattern I'm seeing, she'd say, producing her wellness journal with its detailed documentation of my supposed decline. She's been having more frequent episodes of confusion, and I'm worried that she might not be managing her medications properly. Dr. Whitmore would review Vanessa's notes with the kind of attention she'd give to any family member who was advocating for an elderly patient's care. The documentation looked professional and thorough, exactly the kind of detailed record-keeping that medical professionals appreciate when trying to understand a patient's changing condition. But what neither Dr. Whitmore nor I realized at the time was that Vanessa wasn't documenting my natural aging process. She was creating evidence to support a narrative she'd been carefully constructing for months. Every symptom she recorded in that journal was either caused by whatever she was putting in my tea or exaggerated beyond recognition to fit her predetermined storyline. The most chilling aspect of this period was how Vanessa managed to make me complicit in my own victimization. She'd convinced me that I needed her help, that my judgment wasn't as reliable as it used to be, and that the smart thing to do was to trust her professional expertise and allow her to take a more active role in managing my affairs. By the spring of 2019, almost a year after their wedding, Vanessa had successfully positioned herself as my primary advocate and decision-maker. She had detailed documentation of my supposed cognitive decline, intimate knowledge of my financial situation, and the trust of my medical team. More importantly, she'd convinced me that I was lucky to have such a caring daughter-in-law who was willing to help me navigate the challenges of aging. What I didn't realize was that every gesture of care, every offer of assistance, every expression of concern was part of a methodical plan to establish the groundwork for my eventual murder. Vanessa hadn't just been helping me prepare for my golden years. She'd been preparing me for death, while making sure that when it came, it would look like the natural and expected conclusion to a well-documented period of decline. The woman I'd welcomed into my family as a daughter had spent over a year systematically destroying my health, my independence, and my ability to protect myself, all while maintaining the perfect facade of loving family devotion. And the most terrifying part was how completely she'd succeeded in making me grateful for her help. By the fall of 2022, the symptoms I'd been experiencing for over 3 years had progressed to the point where I was genuinely frightened about my health. What had started as occasional dizziness and mild forgetfulness had evolved into episodes where I'd lose track of entire conversations, find myself standing in rooms with no memory of why I'd gone there, and experience periods of confusion that left me questioning my own sanity. The scariest incident happened on a Tuesday morning in October, when I woke up on my kitchen floor with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My head was throbbing, there was a bruise on my right shoulder, and the clock showed 3:47 a.m. I must have fallen during the night, but I couldn't remember getting up, walking to the kitchen, or what might have caused me to collapse. When I called Vanessa the next morning to tell her about the fall, her response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, she was at my house with Trevor, both of them expressing the kind of intense concern that felt both comforting and suffocating. "Mom, this can't continue," Trevor said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine worry. "You could have been seriously hurt. What if you'd hit your head on the corner of the counter? What if you'd been unconscious for hours and no one found you?" Vanessa was already taking photos of my bruises and the scene in the kitchen, claiming she wanted to document everything for the doctor. She measured the distance from where I must have fallen to the nearest sharp objects, noted the time of the incident in her ever-present wellness journal, and made detailed observations about my apparent confusion regarding what had happened. "Eleanor, honey, I think it's time we seriously considered getting you some additional support," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Living alone is becoming dangerous for you, and we can't bear the thought of something worse happening." That was when they introduced the idea of daily check-ins and what Vanessa called medication management assistance. She explained that many elderly people struggled with remembering to take their medications correctly, and that missing doses or taking incorrect amounts could contribute to the kind of episodes I'd been experiencing. "I've arranged for a daily pill organizer system," Vanessa said, producing an elaborate weekly pill container with separate compartments for morning, afternoon, and evening medications. "I'll come by every Sunday to fill it for the week, and we'll add some additional supplements that should help with your cognitive function and energy levels." The new supplements were larger and more numerous than anything I'd been taking before. Vanessa explained that they contained concentrated vitamins and minerals specifically formulated for older adults with cognitive concerns. She'd researched them extensively, she said, and had consulted with a nutritionist who specialized in senior health. "These aren't just vitamins, Eleanor," she said as she carefully arranged the pills in my new organizer. "They're pharmaceutical-grade supplements that can actually help slow or reverse some of the changes you've been experiencing. But they only work if you take them consistently, exactly as prescribed." What I didn't realize was that Vanessa had also begun systematically isolating me from my support network. She'd started making subtle comments to my longtime friends about my declining condition, suggesting that visits might be too stimulating or confusing for me. She'd call ahead to cancel social engagements on my behalf, explaining that I wasn't feeling well or had become too easily overwhelmed to handle social situations. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, my neighbor for over 20 years, later told me that Vanessa had called her in November to express concern about my mental state. "She said you'd been calling her at all hours, confused about what day it was," Dorothy explained. "She was worried that you might be developing dementia and suggested that unexpected visitors might make your confusion worse." My longtime customers at Hartfield Catering began receiving similar messages. Vanessa would call to postpone or cancel events, explaining that I was dealing with health issues that made it difficult for me to maintain my usual standards. She'd express concern about my ability to safely handle food preparation and suggest that it might be better to refer clients to other caterers until my condition stabilized. "We just want to make sure Eleanor doesn't overextend herself," she'd tell potential clients. At her age, stress can really exacerbate cognitive problems, and we're trying to create a calm, supportive environment for her recovery. Within 6 months, my thriving catering business had dwindled to almost nothing. The few remaining clients were handled by Vanessa herself, who'd convinced them that she was helping me transition toward retirement by gradually taking over the administrative aspects of the business. She'd positioned herself as my business partner and eventual successor, someone who understood my methods and could maintain my standards while protecting my health. The financial implications were devastating, but Vanessa framed them as an opportunity rather than a crisis. She suggested that this was the perfect time to sell the business assets and transition into full retirement, especially since my health concerns made it unrealistic to continue working at my previous pace. "Eleanor, you've worked so hard for so many years," she'd say as we reviewed my declining income and mounting medical expenses. "Maybe this is the universe telling you it's time to slow down and enjoy the security you've built. You don't need to keep working yourself into the ground." She offered to help me liquidate my catering equipment, sell my commercial van, and close the business properly to maximize the financial return. She'd handle all the paperwork, she said, and make sure I got the best possible price for everything. All I had to do was sign the necessary documents and trust her to manage the details. But the most insidious part of Vanessa's systematic destruction was how she began preparing for my death while appearing to fight for my life. She arranged for me to see a neurologist, Dr. Marcus Hoffman, who specialized in age-related cognitive decline. She accompanied me to the appointment with her detailed wellness journal and months of carefully documented symptoms. "Doctor, I'm so worried about my mother-in-law," she said, her voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "She's been declining so rapidly, and I'm terrified that we're going to lose her. Is there anything we can do to slow this progression?" Dr. Hoffman reviewed Vanessa's documentation with the kind of careful attention that her professional presentation deserved. The journal showed a clear pattern of deteriorating cognitive function over several years, with increasing frequency and severity of episodes. The progression was consistent with early-stage dementia, he explained, possibly complicated by medication interactions or underlying cardiovascular issues. "Mrs. Hartfield," he said gently, "based on what your daughter-in-law has documented, it appears you're experiencing significant cognitive changes that warrant careful monitoring and treatment. We'll need to run some tests to determine the underlying cause, but I want you to know that having such detailed family support gives you the best possible chance for maintaining your quality of life." The tests Dr. Hoffman ordered, brain scans, blood work, cognitive assessments, all came back with results that seemed to confirm Vanessa's documentation. My cognitive function was indeed impaired, my blood chemistry showed some irregularities, and the brain imaging revealed changes consistent with age-related decline. What none of us realized was that these test results reflected the effects of whatever Vanessa had been systematically putting in my system for over 3 years. The cognitive impairment, the chemical imbalances, the brain changes. They weren't natural aging. They were evidence of deliberate poisoning that had been carefully calibrated to mimic normal decline while avoiding detection. Dr. Hoffman prescribed medications to help manage my symptoms and slow the progression of what he believed was early dementia. He also recommended that I consider assisted living arrangements within the next year, explaining that my condition was likely to worsen and that having professional support would become essential for my safety. "Mrs. Hartfield, I know this is difficult to hear," he said during our follow-up appointment, "but planning for increased care needs is one of the most loving things you can do for your family. It prevents crisis situations and ensures you'll receive appropriate support as your condition progresses." Vanessa was ready with research about local assisted living facilities, complete with brochures, pricing information, and visiting schedules. She'd already toured several options, she said, and had identified a few that would provide excellent care while being close enough for regular family visits. "Eleanor, I know this feels overwhelming," she said as we looked through the glossy marketing materials, "but I promise Trevor and I will be involved every step of the way. We'll make sure you're comfortable and well cared for, no matter what." The assisted living facility she recommended most highly was Sunset Manor, an upscale residence about 30 minutes outside Riverside Valley. The monthly fees were substantial, almost $6,000 per month, but Vanessa explained that the quality of care justified the expense. They specialized in memory care, she said, and had an excellent reputation for helping families navigate the challenges of cognitive decline. What made Sunset Manor particularly appealing to Vanessa, I later realized, was its location and policies. The facility was far enough from town that spontaneous visits from friends would be unlikely, and their security protocols limited visitor access to pre-approved family members. Once I was a resident there, Vanessa would have complete control over who could see me and when. By the spring of 2023, Vanessa had successfully dismantled every aspect of my independent life. My business was closed, my social connections were severed, my health was deteriorating rapidly, and my financial resources were being drained by medical expenses and care costs. I was completely dependent on her for managing my medications, my appointments, and my daily needs. More terrifyingly, I was beginning to believe her narrative about my condition. The documented evidence of my decline was overwhelming. The medical professionals confirmed her concerns, and my own experience seemed to support everything she was saying. Maybe I really was losing my mind. Maybe I really did need the kind of intensive support she was recommending. The woman who had once built a successful business from nothing, who had raised a son as a single mother while working 3 jobs, who had earned a college degree through night school, was being systematically convinced that she was no longer capable of making rational decisions about her own life. What I didn't understand was that this complete destruction of my independence and self-confidence wasn't the tragic conclusion to my story. It was the final preparation phase before Vanessa and Trevor implemented the last stage of their plan, my death. The moment that changed everything happened on a Sunday evening in late August 2023, exactly 7 months after I'd first seen those devastating text messages. I was sitting in my living room, feeling the familiar fog descending over my thoughts after drinking Vanessa's special tea, when her phone rang in the kitchen where she'd left it while helping me organize my weekly medications. The ringtone was different from Trevor's usual call, a musical chime that indicated a text message rather than a phone call. Under normal circumstances, I would never have considered looking at someone else's private communications. But these weren't normal circumstances, and something about the timing of that message, arriving just as I was experiencing another wave of confusion and disorientation, triggered an instinct I'd learned to trust during my years in business. I walked to the kitchen on unsteady legs, my vision slightly blurred from whatever was in that evening's tea blend, and looked at the message notification on Vanessa's locked phone screen. What I saw made my blood freeze, despite the warm August evening. The message was from a contact labeled Dr. Research, and the preview text was enough to shatter every assumption I'd held about my condition. Latest batch of cognitive disruptors arrived. Increased dosage gradually over next 2 weeks. Patient showing expected deterioration timeline. My hands shook as I stared at those words, trying to process their implications through the chemical fog that seemed to surround my thoughts whenever I spent time in Trevor and Vanessa's house. Cognitive disruptors. Patient. Expected deterioration timeline. The clinical language was unmistakable. I wasn't experiencing natural aging or early dementia. I was being systematically poisoned by people who were monitoring my decline, like a medical experiment. The phone locked before I could see any more of the message, but what I'd already seen was enough to trigger a cascade of realizations that cut through years of carefully constructed lies. The special tea that Vanessa insisted would help my energy and mental clarity. The supplements that were supposedly pharmaceutical-grade vitamins. The gradual increase in my symptoms that always seemed to coincide with changes in my medication routine. I wasn't losing my mind. Someone was taking it from me, chemically and systematically, while documenting the process for purposes I was only beginning to understand. Vanessa returned to the kitchen a few minutes later, finding me standing by the counter where I'd been staring at her phone. If she noticed anything unusual about my expression or posture, she didn't show it. She simply picked up her phone with her usual casual efficiency and slipped it into her purse. "How are you feeling, Eleanor?" she asked with that practiced concern I now recognized as performance art. "You look a little pale. Maybe you should sit down and let that tea settle." I nodded and returned to my chair in the living room, but my mind was racing with a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. The chemical fog was still there, but underneath it was a growing flame of pure rage that seemed to burn through whatever they'd been giving me. For the first time in years, I felt like Eleanor Hartfield again. Not the confused, declining elderly woman they'd been creating, but the sharp-minded business owner who'd built something from nothing and survived every challenge life had thrown at her. As Trevor and Vanessa prepared to leave that evening, going through their usual routine of concerned instructions about my medications and reminders about upcoming appointments, I watched them with new eyes. Every gesture of care now revealed itself as part of an elaborate charade. Every expression of love was a mask covering calculated cruelty. "Don't forget to take your evening supplements, Mom," Trevor said as he kissed my forehead. The same gentle kiss he'd given me as a child when I'd tucked him into bed. "Vanessa says they're really important for helping you sleep better." I promised I would take them, just as I'd been promising for months, but this time I was lying. This time I had a plan that went far beyond simply refusing their poison. After they left, I sat in my living room, surrounded by the pill organizers, supplements, and medical documentation that Vanessa had carefully arranged to support her narrative of my decline. But instead of feeling overwhelmed by the evidence of my supposed deterioration, I felt energized by the challenge of dismantling the elaborate fraud they'd constructed around me. The first thing I did was pour every single pill and supplement down my kitchen drain, watching years of systematic poisoning disappear into the plumbing system. The special tea went next. Every bag, every loose leaf, every carefully measured blend that Vanessa had brought from her mysterious sources. I wanted every trace of their chemical manipulation out of my house immediately. Next, I called my oldest and most trusted friend, Beverly Richardson, a retired nurse who'd worked at Riverside Valley Community Hospital for over 40 years. Beverly had been trying to visit me for months, but Vanessa had always managed to intercept her calls and discourage her visits with stories about my fragile mental state and need for quiet. "Eleanor?" Beverly's voice was filled with surprise and concern when she answered my call at nearly 10 p.m. "Honey, how are you? Vanessa told me you'd been having a rough time, and I didn't want to overwhelm you with visits." "Beverly," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months, "I need you to come over right now. And I need you to bring your nursing experience because I think someone has been poisoning me for the past 3 years." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I thought we might have been disconnected. When Beverly spoke again, her voice had shifted from casual concern to professional urgency. "Eleanor, that's a very serious accusation. Are you certain about what you're saying? Have you been taking any new medications that might be affecting your thinking?" "Beverly, I've been taking medications that I now believe were designed to affect my thinking," I said. "I need someone I trust to help me figure out what's been done to me and how to prove it." Beverly arrived at my house within 20 minutes, carrying a small bag that I recognized as the kind nurses used for home health visits. She hugged me with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd spent decades advocating for vulnerable patients, then stepped back to look at me with the critical eye of a medical professional. "Eleanor, tell me everything," she said as we sat at my kitchen table. "Start from the beginning and don't leave out any details, no matter how small they seem." I told her about the text message I'd seen, about years of special teas and supplements, about the gradual onset of symptoms that had coincided with Vanessa's increasing involvement in my care. I showed her the elaborate pill organizers, the wellness journal that documented my supposed decline, and the medical records that painted a picture of rapid cognitive deterioration. Beverly listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a small notebook she'd brought with her. When I finished my account, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing what I'd told her with the methodical approach of someone who'd seen every kind of medical mystery and family dysfunction during her long career. "Eleanor," she said finally, "what you're describing sounds like systematic poisoning designed to mimic dementia or other age-related cognitive decline. The gradual onset, the specific symptoms, the way your condition seemed to worsen whenever you increased certain medications, it all fits a pattern I've seen before, unfortunately." She explained that during her years in hospital nursing, she'd encountered several cases where family members had slowly poisoned elderly relatives, usually for financial gain. The key was using substances that would cause cognitive impairment and physical symptoms that looked like natural aging or disease progression. The most sophisticated perpetrators use combinations of drugs that are difficult to detect in standard medical testing, Beverly said. They'll use things like sedatives, blood pressure medications, or even common supplements in doses that cause cumulative damage over time. The symptoms develop so gradually that doctors assume they're seeing normal aging or early dementia. But Beverly also told me something that filled me with hope for the first time in months. If I stopped taking the substances immediately and worked with the right medical professionals, many of the effects could be reversed. The brain damage from some poisons was permanent, but cognitive impairment from most pharmaceutical substances could improve dramatically once the toxins were eliminated from my system. Eleanor, the fact that you were able to recognize what was happening and call me suggests that your core mental function is still intact, she said. Whatever they were giving you was affecting your thinking, but it hadn't destroyed your intelligence or your survival instincts. That night, Beverly helped me create what she called a recovery and evidence plan. We documented everything I could remember about my symptoms, my medications, and the timeline of my decline. We collected samples of the remaining supplements and tea blends for potential laboratory analysis. Most importantly, we developed a strategy for protecting me from further poisoning while gathering the evidence needed to expose what Trevor and Vanessa had been doing. The plan required me to pretend that nothing had changed while secretly working to rebuild my health and build a case against them. I would continue attending our Sunday dinners and taking the medications they gave me, but I'd dispose of everything afterward and document their behavior with the objectivity of someone who finally understood what they were really doing. Eleanor, Beverly said as she prepared to leave that night, what these people have done to you is attempted murder. They've been slowly killing you while pretending to care for you, and they've been documenting the process to make your eventual death look natural. But now that you know what's happening, you have the power to stop them and make sure they face consequences for what they've done. As I watched Beverly drive away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope mixed with determination and seasoned with a cold fury that surprised me with its intensity. Trevor and Vanessa thought they were dealing with a confused, declining elderly woman who would be grateful for their help until the day she conveniently died. Instead, they were about to discover that they'd awakened Eleanor Hartfield, the woman who'd built a business from nothing, raised a son alone, and survived every challenge life had thrown at her. And this Eleanor Hartfield was going to make sure that their carefully planned murder became the instrument of their own complete destruction. The transformation began immediately. Within 48 hours of stopping Vanessa's poison regimen, the fog that had clouded my thinking for months started to lift. Colors seemed brighter, conversations became easier to follow, and most importantly, my memory began functioning with a clarity that reminded me of who I used to be before they started their systematic destruction of my mind. Beverly returned the next evening with reinforcements. Her daughter Rachel, who worked as a paralegal at Morrison & Associates, the largest law firm in Riverside Valley. Rachel specialized in elder abuse cases and had seen enough family financial fraud to recognize the patterns immediately when Beverly explained my situation. Mrs. Hartfield, Rachel said as she reviewed the timeline we'd created the night before, what you're describing isn't just attempted murder. It's a sophisticated long-term fraud scheme that probably involves identity theft, insurance fraud, financial exploitation, and conspiracy. These people have been building a case for your incompetence, while systematically stealing your independence and your assets. She helped us understand the legal framework we'd need to build our case. We'd need medical evidence proving the poisoning, documentation of the financial manipulation, proof of their intent to harm me, and witnesses who could testify about the changes in my condition and behavior over the past 3 years. The good news, Rachel explained, is that people who commit these kinds of elaborate frauds usually leave extensive paper trails. They document everything because they want to look professional and thorough. That documentation becomes evidence against them once we understand what they were really doing. Our first priority was getting me proper medical care to document the effects of whatever substances they'd been giving me. Beverly arranged for me to see Dr. Amanda Cross, a toxicologist at Regional Medical Center, who specialized in cases of suspected poisoning. We told Dr. Cross that I believed I'd been given substances without my knowledge, and that I needed comprehensive testing to determine what had been done to me. The blood work and toxicology screening Dr. Cross ordered revealed traces of several prescription medications that I'd never been prescribed: low-dose sedatives, mild antipsychotics, and blood pressure medications that would cause dizziness and confusion when given to someone who didn't need them. The levels weren't high enough to cause immediate death, but they were sufficient to create the kind of cognitive impairment and physical symptoms that would support a diagnosis of dementia or other age-related decline. Mrs. Hartfield, Dr. Cross said as she reviewed my test results, these substances have been in your system for an extended period, probably months or years, based on the tissue absorption patterns we're seeing. The combination would definitely cause the symptoms you've described: memory problems, confusion, balance issues, and general cognitive impairment. More importantly, Dr. Cross confirmed what Beverly had told me about recovery. With proper medical support and complete elimination of the toxins, most of my cognitive function should return to normal within a few weeks. Some of the physical effects might take longer to resolve, but the mental clarity I was already experiencing suggested that no permanent damage had been done. While I was working with Dr. Cross to document the medical evidence, Rachel was helping me investigate the financial aspects of Trevor and Vanessa's scheme. We started by reviewing all my accounts, investments, and insurance policies to see what changes had been made during the period when I was being poisoned. What we discovered was staggering. Over the past 2 years, while I'd been gradually losing my ability to think clearly, someone had been systematically restructuring my financial life. My life insurance policy had been increased to $750,000, with Trevor as the sole beneficiary. My retirement accounts had been consolidated under Vanessa's investment firm, giving her direct access to my portfolio. Most damaging, my will had been updated 3 times, each revision giving Trevor and Vanessa greater control over my assets and reducing the charitable donations I'd originally planned to make. Mrs. Hartfield, Rachel said as we reviewed the paperwork, these changes weren't made randomly. Someone with detailed knowledge of estate planning and insurance fraud created a systematic strategy to maximize the financial benefit from your death while minimizing the chance that anyone would question the circumstances. The most chilling discovery was a folder on Trevor's computer that Rachel's boyfriend, a computer technician named James, helped us access when Trevor and Vanessa were out of town for a long weekend. The folder contained detailed financial projections showing exactly how much money they stood to inherit from my death, timeline estimates for how long the poisoning process would take, and research about which causes of death would be least likely to trigger insurance investigations. They'd calculated that my death would net them approximately $1.2 million when combining the life insurance payout, my retirement savings, the sale of my house, and the liquidation of my business assets. They'd researched the probate process, identified which medical conditions would seem most natural for someone my age, and even selected the funeral home they planned to use and the type of memorial service that would make them look like grieving family members. But the most damning evidence was their correspondence with someone identified only as Dr. Research, the same contact whose text message I'd seen on Vanessa's phone. The email exchanges revealed that Vanessa had been working with someone who supplied untraceable pharmaceuticals specifically designed to cause symptoms that mimicked natural aging and cognitive decline. The supplier, who appeared to be a former pharmaceutical researcher with connections to overseas manufacturers, had provided detailed instructions about dosage schedules, symptom management, and how to avoid detection during medical examinations. The emails read like a technical manual for committing the perfect murder, complete with troubleshooting advice for unexpected complications. While Rachel worked on building our legal case, I focused on recruiting additional allies who could help us gather evidence and support our eventual prosecution of Trevor and Vanessa. My first stop was Dorothy Kellerman, my neighbor who'd been told I was too confused and fragile for visitors. When I appeared at Dorothy's door, looking alert and coherent for the first time in months, her reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. "Eleanor," she exclaimed, pulling me into a fierce hug. "My God, you look like yourself again. What happened?" "Vanessa told me you were having terrible problems with your memory and that visitors made you agitated." I explained the situation to Dorothy, who listened with the kind of outrage that only comes from someone who's witnessed a friend being systematically abused. She immediately offered to help in any way possible, And more importantly, she provided crucial testimony about how Vanessa had been controlling access to me and spreading false information about my condition. "Eleanor, I knew something was wrong," Dorothy said. "You've been sharp as a tack for the 20 years I've known you, and the woman Vanessa described sounded like a completely different person. But she was so convincing, so concerned, and she had all that medical documentation." My next ally was Jake Morrison, Trevor's childhood friend who'd been gradually pushed out of our lives by Vanessa's influence. When I called Jake and asked if he could meet me for coffee, his surprise was evident in his voice. "Mrs. Hartfield," I thought. "I mean, Trevor said you weren't feeling well, that you weren't really up for visitors anymore." I met Jake at Riverside Diner, the same place where I'd taken him and Trevor for lunch after their high school baseball games. When I explained what had been happening, Jake's reaction was a mixture of shock, anger, and guilt, that he hadn't recognized what was going on. "I knew something was off about Vanessa," he said, shaking his head. "She was always trying to get Trevor to distance himself from his old friends, always making comments about how we weren't good influences or weren't successful enough for him to associate with. But this, Mrs. Hartfield, this is beyond anything I could have imagined." Jake became one of our most valuable allies because he'd maintained friendships with several other people who'd known Trevor before Vanessa's influence took hold. He helped us contact Danny Chen, Mike Patterson, and Sarah Williams, all people who'd noticed changes in Trevor's behavior and had been gradually excluded from his life as Vanessa gained more control. Each of these friends provided testimony about how Trevor had changed after marrying Vanessa, how he'd become secretive and distant, and how Vanessa had systematically undermined his relationships with anyone who might have questioned her influence. They'd all noticed my apparent decline, but Vanessa had explained it in ways that discouraged them from reaching out to offer help. The most valuable ally we recruited was someone I hadn't expected. Marcus Webb, the pharmacist at Riverside Valley Pharmacy, where I'd been getting my prescriptions filled for over 15 years. Marcus had been noticing irregularities in my medication orders for months, but hadn't known how to address his concerns without seeming to question my doctor's judgment. "Mrs. Hartfield," Marcus explained when Rachel and I met with him, "someone has been calling in prescription changes for you regularly, always claiming to be calling on behalf of Dr. Hoffman or your other physicians, but the combinations of medications didn't make sense for someone with your medical history, and some of the dosages seemed inappropriate for your age and condition." Marcus had been keeping detailed records of these prescription irregularities, including recordings of the phone calls where someone claimed to be adjusting my medications on doctor's orders. When we played these recordings, Vanessa's voice was clearly identifiable, even though she'd been claiming to be a nurse from various medical offices. "I should have called your doctors directly to verify these changes," Marcus said, clearly feeling guilty about his role in the poisoning. "But the person calling always had detailed information about your medical history and seemed to know exactly what they were talking about. They sounded so professional, so concerned about getting your treatment right." By the end of our first week of investigation, we had assembled a team of allies that would have made any prosecuting attorney proud. Beverly provided medical expertise and nursing experience. Rachel brought legal knowledge and investigative skills. Dorothy, Jake, and Trevor's other friends offered testimony about the isolation and manipulation they'd witnessed. Marcus provided pharmaceutical evidence and recorded proof of prescription fraud. Most importantly, we had Dr. Cross's toxicology reports proving that I'd been systematically poisoned, and James's computer forensics evidence showing Trevor and Vanessa's detailed planning for my death and their anticipated financial windfall. But we also had something that Trevor and Vanessa could never have anticipated: a group of people who genuinely cared about my welfare and were motivated by love and loyalty rather than greed and selfishness. They'd been counting on my isolation and dependence to prevent anyone from questioning my decline or investigating the circumstances of my eventual death. Instead, their systematic cruelty had awakened a network of allies who were determined to ensure that justice was served, and that their elaborate murder plot became the foundation for their own destruction. The hunt was on, And this time, I wasn't the prey. The beauty of our counterattack was its simplicity. We were going to use Trevor and Vanessa's own methods against them. They'd spent 3 years building a careful facade of concerned family members while systematically destroying my life. Now I was going to build an equally careful facade of a confused elderly woman while systematically destroying theirs. The first phase of our strategy began on a Sunday evening in mid-September, exactly 3 weeks after I'd discovered the truth about their poisoning scheme. I arrived at their house for our regular family dinner, carrying the same confused, fragile demeanor they'd grown accustomed to seeing, but with a recording device hidden in my purse and a clear mind cataloging every detail of their performance. "Eleanor, you look tired," Vanessa said with her practiced concern as she helped me to my usual chair in their dining room. "Have you been remembering to take your evening medications? I worry that you might be getting confused about the schedule." "Oh, you know how it is," I replied, allowing just the right amount of uncertainty to creep into my voice. "Some days are better than others. I think I took them, but I can't always remember." What Trevor and Vanessa didn't know was that Rachel had coached me extensively on how to appear confused while maintaining perfect mental clarity. The key was to seem forgetful about minor details, while remaining completely sharp about the important information I needed to gather. I was playing a role, but unlike their performance, mine had a specific endgame that would expose their fraud completely. During dinner, I carefully guided the conversation toward topics that would reveal their true intentions. I mentioned feeling dizzy after taking my medications, expressed concern about my increasing medical expenses, and worried aloud about becoming a burden on my family. Each comment was designed to elicit responses that would demonstrate their eagerness for my condition to worsen. "Mom, don't say things like that," Trevor said, reaching across the table to pat my hand with rehearsed affection. "You're not a burden. Vanessa and I are happy to help you through this difficult time." But the recording device in my purse was capturing something different in his tone. A subtle excitement when I mentioned my worsening symptoms, a barely concealed satisfaction when I expressed fears about my declining health. For someone who knew what to listen for, Trevor's supposed concern revealed itself as anticipation. Vanessa was even more revealing. When I mentioned that Dr. Cross had suggested some additional medical tests to better understand my condition, Vanessa's response was immediate and alarmed. "Eleanor, honey, I'm not sure that's necessary," she said, her voice carrying an urgency that contradicted her usual calm professionalism. "You've already been through so many tests, and they're so stressful at your age. Maybe we should focus on keeping you comfortable, rather than putting you through more medical procedures." She was terrified that additional medical testing would reveal what they'd been doing to me. Her suggestion that we avoid further medical investigation wasn't motivated by concern for my comfort. It was desperate damage control to prevent the discovery of their poisoning scheme. The most damning moment came when I mentioned that I'd been thinking about updating my will again to include some charitable donations I'd been considering. The look that passed between Trevor and Vanessa was so quick that someone who wasn't watching for it might have missed it entirely. But I saw it clearly. Panic, followed by immediate calculation about how to discourage me from making any changes to my estate planning. "Mom, that's a big decision," Trevor said carefully. "Maybe we should wait until your health stabilizes before making any major financial changes. When you're feeling better, we can sit down and really think through what makes the most sense." What he was really saying was that they needed me to die before I had a chance to alter the financial arrangements that would maximize their inheritance. Any changes to my will or beneficiary designations would complicate their plan and potentially reduce the money they stood to gain from my murder. After dinner, as Vanessa prepared my special tea, I excused myself to use the bathroom and quickly photographed the contents of her spice cabinet. Beverly had explained that many of the substances used in systematic poisoning were hidden in everyday household items, herbs, spices, or supplements that would seem innocent to casual observers, but could be toxic when used in specific combinations or dosages. The photographs revealed several items that didn't belong in a normal kitchen: bottles labeled with chemical names rather than common spice names, pharmaceutical supplies that had no legitimate culinary purpose, and measuring devices that were far more precise than anything needed for cooking. Vanessa had essentially turned her kitchen into a poison laboratory while maintaining the appearance of domestic normalcy. When I returned to the dining room, Vanessa was waiting with my tea and evening medications, smiling with the same warm concern she'd been showing for 3 years. But now I understood exactly what that smile meant. She was administering what she believed would be another step closer to my death. "Here you go, Eleanor," she said, watching carefully as I raised the teacup to my lips. "This blend is especially good for helping you sleep peacefully." I took small sips while maintaining eye contact, allowing her to believe she was successfully continuing my poisoning while the recording device captured her, encouraging me to consume substances that were designed to harm me. Every word of encouragement, every expression of concern, every gentle insistence that I finish the entire cup was being documented as evidence of attempted murder. The second phase of our counterattack involved systematically exposing their fraud to the professional and social networks they'd cultivated. Rachel had helped me understand that people like Trevor and Vanessa depended on their reputations for both their careers and their social standing. Destroying their credibility would be almost as devastating as legal prosecution. We started with their employers. Rachel had researched the ethical guidelines that governed both Steinberg Engineering and Pemberton and Associates, and had discovered that both companies had strict policies about employees who were involved in criminal activities or who brought negative attention to the firm's reputation. Using a carefully crafted anonymous tip, we alerted both companies to the fact that Trevor Hartfield and Vanessa Caldwell were under investigation for elder abuse and fraud involving systematic poisoning of a family member. The tips included enough specific information to be credible without revealing our investigation or compromising our evidence gathering. The response was immediate and exactly what we'd hoped for. Both Trevor and Vanessa were called in for meetings with their supervisors to discuss the allegations and their potential impact on their professional standing. Trevor was suspended pending the outcome of any legal proceedings, while Vanessa was transferred to a position with no client contact and restricted access to sensitive financial information. The professional consequences created immediate financial pressure that forced them to accelerate their timeline. With Trevor's income suspended and Vanessa's career prospects damaged, they needed my death to happen sooner rather than later to access the inheritance money they'd been counting on. This desperation led to the kind of mistakes that would ultimately destroy them completely. Vanessa began increasing the dosages in my medications more aggressively, trying to speed up my decline before their fraud could be fully exposed. She started making more frequent calls to pharmacist Marcus Webb, ordering prescription changes with increasing urgency and decreasing attention to maintaining her professional facade. Each of these accelerated actions created additional evidence of their intent to harm me. The recorded phone calls to the pharmacy showed clear escalation in Vanessa's attempts to obtain dangerous drug combinations. The increased chemical residues in the medications they gave me provided stronger toxicological evidence of systematic poisoning. Most importantly, their growing desperation made them careless about maintaining their performance as loving family members. The stress of potential exposure caused cracks in their facade that made their true motivations increasingly obvious to anyone who was paying attention. The third phase of our counterattack was the most personally satisfying. We began systematically undermining their social standing in the same way they'd isolated me from my support network. Using the same methods Vanessa had used to spread false information about my condition, we began sharing carefully selected truths about their character and behavior with their friends, neighbors, and social contacts. Dorothy Kellerman proved particularly effective at this phase of our strategy. At a neighborhood barbecue, she casually mentioned to several of Trevor and Vanessa's neighbors that she'd been concerned about some unusual activity at their house. Strange visitors, late-night deliveries, and conversations she'd overheard about managing dosages and accelerating timelines. Jake Morrison reached out to mutual friends from Trevor's college years, expressing concern about dramatic changes in Trevor's personality and values since his marriage to Vanessa. He didn't make direct accusations, but he raised questions about Trevor's sudden wealth, his willingness to cut ties with longtime friends, and his apparent lack of concern about his mother's rapidly declining health. Beverly used her connections in the medical community to share concerns about a case she'd heard about involving systematic elder abuse disguised as family caregiving. Without mentioning names, she described the methods being used and the warning signs that medical professionals should watch for, ensuring that Trevor and Vanessa's names would be connected to the case when the investigation became public. By the end of September, Trevor and Vanessa's carefully constructed life was beginning to unravel at every level. Their professional reputations were damaged, their financial security was threatened, their social standing was deteriorating, and their murder plot was creating increasingly obvious evidence that would eventually destroy them completely. But they still believed they were in control. They still thought they were dealing with a confused elderly woman who was gradually dying from natural causes. They had no idea that their intended victim had not only discovered their scheme, but had assembled a team of allies who were systematically dismantling every aspect of their fraudulent existence. The final phase of our counterattack was about to begin, and it would leave them with nothing but criminal charges and the knowledge that they'd been outmaneuvered by the same woman they'd spent 3 years trying to murder. The end came swiftly once we had gathered enough evidence to ensure their complete destruction. On October 15, 2023, exactly 2 months after I'd discovered their murder plot, Detective Sarah Martinez of the Riverside Valley Police Department arrived at my house with a warrant to search Trevor and Vanessa's residence and arrest them on charges of attempted murder, elder abuse, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. Rachel had spent weeks working with the district attorney's office to build an airtight case that would guarantee conviction. The evidence we'd assembled was overwhelming. Toxicology reports proving systematic poisoning, recorded conversations showing their intent to harm me, financial records documenting their inheritance scheme, and computer forensics revealing their detailed murder planning with timeline projections and profit calculations. But the most damning evidence came from their own arrogance. In their desperation to accelerate my death before their fraud could be exposed, they'd made increasingly reckless mistakes that provided irrefutable proof of their criminal intent. Vanessa's recorded phone calls to the pharmacy had become so obviously fraudulent that Marcus Webb had started documenting every conversation as potential evidence. The chemical residues in my medications had reached levels that could only indicate deliberate poisoning rather than accidental contamination. I was sitting in my living room with Beverly when Detective Martinez called to tell me that the arrests had been completed. Trevor and Vanessa had been taken into custody at their workplace, led away in handcuffs in front of colleagues and clients who'd believed they were upstanding professionals rather than would-be murderers. "Mrs. Hartfield," Detective Martinez said, "I've been investigating elder abuse cases for 15 years, and I've never seen evidence this comprehensive or a victim this courageous in fighting back. What you've accomplished here will help protect other elderly people from similar crimes for years to come." The arraignment hearing was held 3 days later, and I attended with my entire support team, Beverly, Rachel, Dorothy, Jake, and several other friends who'd helped expose Trevor and Vanessa's fraud. The courtroom was packed with people who'd known our family for years, many of them still struggling to believe that Trevor Hartfield, the sweet boy they'd watched grow up, had tried to murder his own mother for money. When Trevor and Vanessa were led into the courtroom in orange jail uniforms, the transformation from their previous polished appearance was shocking. Trevor looked haggard and defeated, his engineer's precision replaced by the desperate confusion of someone who couldn't understand how his perfect plan had fallen apart. Vanessa maintained her composure better, but there was a hardness in her expression that revealed the calculating predator she'd always been beneath her professional facade. The charges read by the prosecutor were extensive and carried sentences that would effectively end their lives as free people. Attempted murder in the first degree, with the enhancement of using poison against an elderly victim. Elder abuse with financial exploitation. Insurance fraud involving life insurance policies exceeding $500,000. Conspiracy to commit murder. Fraudulent prescription practices. Identity theft related to accessing my medical and financial records without authorization. Each charge carried mandatory minimum sentences that, when combined, would ensure they spent decades in prison even if they received the most lenient possible judgment. The prosecutor, District Attorney Michael Chen, had made it clear that the state would be seeking maximum penalties given the sophisticated nature of their crimes and the vulnerable status of their victim. Your Honor, D.A. Chen said during his opening statement, this case represents one of the most calculated and cruel examples of elder abuse our office has ever prosecuted. The defendants spent over 3 years systematically poisoning Mrs. Eleanor Hartfield, while presenting themselves as loving family members concerned about her welfare. They documented her decline like a scientific experiment, planned her murder with business-like efficiency, and counted the money they expected to inherit from her death. The bail hearing provided another opportunity to expose the full scope of their fraud. Rachel had prepared a detailed financial analysis showing that Trevor and Vanessa had been living beyond their means for years, accumulating debts and making investments based on their expected inheritance from my death. Their expensive house, luxury cars, and lavish lifestyle had all been financed by credit arrangements that depended on receiving life insurance money within a specific time frame. Judge Patricia Hoffman, who'd been hearing criminal cases in Riverside Valley for over 20 years, denied bail based on the severity of the charges and the defendants' demonstrated willingness to harm vulnerable victims for financial gain. Trevor and Vanessa would remain in county jail until their trial, which was scheduled for the following spring. The media attention surrounding their arrest was immediate and devastating to any remaining shred of their reputations. The Riverside Valley Gazette ran front-page coverage with the headline, "Local Couple Accused of Poisoning Elderly Mother for Insurance Money." The regional television stations picked up the story, featuring interviews with neighbors who expressed shock at learning that the perfect couple in their prestigious neighborhood had been planning murder. But the most satisfying aspect of their exposure was watching their carefully constructed social network abandon them completely. The same people who'd been impressed by their success and sophistication now competed to distance themselves from association with accused murderers. Their country club membership was revoked, their professional licenses were suspended pending criminal proceedings, and their former friends began sharing stories about suspicious behavior they'd noticed but hadn't understood at the time. Vanessa's parents, Richard and Catherine Caldwell, released a public statement expressing their horror at the charges and their complete support for my recovery and pursuit of justice. They revealed that they'd been concerned about Vanessa's increasingly materialistic focus and her apparent resentment toward family obligations, but had never imagined she was capable of attempted murder. "We are devastated to learn what our daughter allegedly did to Mrs. Hartfield," their statement read. "Eleanor Hartfield is a wonderful woman who deserved love and care from her family, not the cruel abuse she apparently received. We support the prosecution's efforts to ensure that justice is served." The financial consequences of their arrest were immediate and complete. Their bank accounts were frozen pending investigation of assets purchased with money intended to come from my death. Their house went into foreclosure when they could no longer make mortgage payments. Their vehicles were repossessed. The lifestyle they'd built while planning my murder collapsed as quickly as their murder plot had been exposed. Trevor's employer, Steinberg Engineering, terminated his employment and launched an internal investigation to determine whether he'd used company resources in planning his crimes. Vanessa's firm, Pemberton & Associates, fired her immediately and began reviewing all her client accounts to ensure she hadn't committed similar fraud against other elderly clients. The investigation expanded as law enforcement agencies realized that Trevor and Vanessa's crimes might not have been limited to their attempt to murder me. Detective Martinez contacted other families who'd worked with Vanessa in her role as a financial advisor, particularly elderly clients who'd experienced unexplained health declines or sudden changes in their estate planning. What they discovered was a pattern of behavior that suggested I might not have been their first victim. 3 other elderly clients had died under suspicious circumstances after working with Vanessa to restructure their finances and update their insurance policies. While these cases would require separate investigations, the evidence from my case provided a roadmap for understanding how Trevor and Vanessa might have been operating a systematic murder for inheritance scheme targeting vulnerable elderly people. Dr. Amanda Cross, the toxicologist who'd helped document my poisoning, testified at a preliminary hearing about the sophisticated nature of the substances found in my system. She explained that the combination of drugs would have been virtually impossible to detect without specific testing, and that the gradual dosage increases were designed to mimic natural cognitive decline while slowly approaching lethal levels. In my professional opinion, Dr. Cross testified, Mrs. Hartfield was within weeks of suffering irreversible organ damage that would have led to her death. The defendant's plan was sophisticated enough that her death would likely have been attributed to natural causes related to age and dementia, particularly given the extensive documentation they'd created about her supposed cognitive decline. The preliminary hearing also revealed the identity of Dr. Research, the supplier who'd provided Vanessa with the pharmaceutical substances used in my poisoning. Federal agents had traced the communications to Dr. Bradley Morrison, a former pharmaceutical researcher who'd lost his license for conducting unauthorized human experiments and had been operating an underground network supplying untraceable poisons to people seeking to harm others without detection. Dr. Morrison's arrest led to the discovery of an entire criminal enterprise involving systematic elder abuse across multiple states. Vanessa had been one of dozens of clients purchasing specialized substances designed to kill elderly victims slowly, while avoiding detection during routine medical examinations. As I sat in the courtroom listening to the evidence against Trevor and Vanessa, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I hadn't expected. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, relief that their plan had been stopped before they could harm anyone else, and vindication that my survival instincts had been correct about their true nature. But there was also profound sadness about what this experience had revealed about human nature. Trevor, the little boy I'd sacrificed everything to raise and educate, had been willing to murder me slowly and painfully for money. The family bonds I'd believed were sacred meant nothing to him compared to the financial gain he expected from my death. The trial was scheduled to begin in March 2024, but Rachel expected that Trevor and Vanessa would eventually accept plea bargains rather than face the overwhelming evidence against them in open court. The sentences they'd receive would ensure they spent the rest of their lives in prison, and any appeal would only prolong their exposure to additional charges as the federal investigation into Dr. Morrison's network continued to expand. As I left the courthouse that day, surrounded by friends who'd helped me survive and expose their crimes, I realized that Trevor and Vanessa's attempt to destroy me had ultimately accomplished something they'd never intended. It had shown me the true value of genuine human connections based on love and loyalty rather than greed and manipulation. 6 months after Trevor and Vanessa's arrest, I stood in my garden on a warm April morning, watching the daffodils bloom and feeling truly alive for the first time in 3 years. The poison was completely out of my system, my cognitive function had returned to normal, and most remarkably, I felt stronger and more purposeful than I had before their attempt to murder me began. The trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier with plea bargains that sentenced Trevor to 25 years in federal prison and Vanessa to 30 years, with no possibility of parole for either of them. They would both die behind bars, their lives destroyed by the same greed that had motivated their attempt to destroy mine. But more importantly, their convictions had exposed a nationwide network of elder abuse that led to federal legislation strengthening protections for vulnerable elderly people across the country. Dr. Bradley Morrison, the doctor research who'd supplied Vanessa with sophisticated poisons, received a life sentence for his role in facilitating the murders of over 40 elderly victims across 12 states. His network had been targeting wealthy seniors with adult children who stood to inherit substantial estates, providing the tools and technical guidance needed to commit undetectable murders that would maximize financial gain while minimizing legal risk. The investigation that began with my case ultimately saved dozens of lives and resulted in criminal charges against 127 people involved in systematic elder abuse schemes. The Eleanor Hartfield Elder Protection Act, signed into law by the governor in February 2024, established mandatory reporting requirements for suspected elder abuse, enhanced penalties for family members who exploit elderly relatives, and created funding for victim advocacy programs in every county. Rachel Morrison, Beverly's daughter who'd helped build the legal case against Trevor and Vanessa, had been promoted to head the new Elder Abuse Prosecution Unit for the State Attorney General's office. She used the experience from my case to train law enforcement agencies, medical professionals, and social service workers to recognize the warning signs of systematic elder abuse and respond effectively to protect vulnerable victims. Mrs. Hartfield, Rachel told me during a recent visit, your courage in fighting back against Trevor and Vanessa didn't just save your own life. It exposed a form of elder abuse that was largely invisible to law enforcement and medical professionals. Now we have the tools and knowledge to prevent these crimes before they succeed. The financial restitution from Trevor and Vanessa's assets, combined with the life insurance money I no longer needed to leave to family members who'd tried to murder me, allowed me to establish the Hartfield Foundation for Elder Safety. The foundation provided grants to organizations working to prevent elder abuse, funded research into detecting financial exploitation of seniors, and supported advocacy programs for elderly people who lacked family support or faced family-based threats. Beverly Richardson, now 78 but still sharp as ever, had become the foundation's first program director. Her nursing experience and natural investigative instincts made her perfectly suited to identify and respond to cases of suspected elder abuse. She'd assembled a team of retired professionals who volunteered their time to help elderly people navigate complex medical and financial systems while protecting them from exploitation. Eleanor, Beverly said as we reviewed the Foundation's first-year report, we've already helped over 300 families identify and stop financial abuse. Your willingness to fight back instead of becoming a victim has created a ripple effect that's protecting people across the entire region. Dorothy Kellerman had become one of our most effective volunteer investigators, using her naturally suspicious nature and excellent memory to identify patterns of behavior that might indicate elder abuse. At 82, she was more energetic and purposeful than many people half her age, driven by the knowledge that her vigilance could prevent other families from experiencing the trauma Trevor and Vanessa had inflicted on me. Jake Morrison, Trevor's former best friend, had struggled with guilt about not recognizing the warning signs of Trevor's transformation into someone capable of attempted murder. He'd channeled that guilt into becoming an advocate for maintaining strong social connections among elderly people, understanding that isolation was often the first step in systematic abuse. Mrs. Hartfield, I keep thinking about all the times Vanessa discouraged Trevor from maintaining his old friendships, Jake told me. If we'd stayed closer, if we'd been more involved in your life, maybe we would have noticed what was happening sooner. I'd assured Jake repeatedly that Trevor and Vanessa's crimes weren't his responsibility, but his sense of obligation had motivated him to create a volunteer program that paired younger community members with elderly residents to provide regular social contact and informal monitoring for signs of abuse or exploitation. The program had been adopted by senior centers throughout the county and was being studied as a model for other communities. Marcus Webb, the pharmacist who'd unknowingly filled fraudulent prescriptions for my poisoning, had implemented new verification procedures that required direct contact with prescribing physicians for any medication changes involving elderly patients. His protocols had been adopted by pharmacies throughout the state and had already prevented several cases of prescription fraud targeting seniors. The most unexpected outcome of our fight against Trevor and Vanessa was the transformation of my own life and sense of purpose. At 71, I'd been planning to wind down my activities and settle into a quiet retirement. Instead, I'd discovered that surviving their murder attempt had given me a platform and credibility that allowed me to make a real difference in protecting other vulnerable people. I testified before state legislative committees about the need for stronger elder abuse laws. I'd spoken at medical conferences about recognizing signs of systematic poisoning. I'd been interviewed by national news programs about the importance of maintaining social connections and advocating for elderly family members who might be experiencing abuse. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in my relationship with the concept of family itself. Trevor's betrayal had shattered my belief that blood relationships guaranteed love and loyalty, but the network of people who'd rallied to help me had demonstrated that chosen family based on mutual care and respect could be stronger than biological connections. Beverly, Rachel, Dorothy, Jake, and dozens of others had become my true family, bound together not by genetics but by shared values and genuine concern for each other's welfare. We celebrated holidays together, supported each other through health crises, and maintained the kind of close relationships that Trevor and Vanessa had tried to destroy through isolation and manipulation. I'd also developed an unexpected relationship with my actual family, or what remained of it. Trevor's younger cousin Amanda, who lived in California, had reached out after learning about the case through news coverage. She'd driven across the country to visit me, bringing her 2 teenage daughters who were horrified to learn what their relative had done to his own mother. "Aunt Eleanor," Amanda said during their visit, "I need you to know that Trevor's actions don't represent our family's values. What he did was monstrous, and I'm ashamed to be related to him. But I'm proud to be related to you, and I want my daughters to understand that family means protecting and caring for each other, not exploiting the people who love you." Amanda and her daughters had become regular visitors, and I was teaching the girls some of the business skills I'd learned during my years running Hartfield Catering. They were bright, ambitious young women who understood the importance of financial independence and weren't afraid of hard work. Everything I'd hoped Trevor would value and pass on to his own children. The house felt different now, too. Instead of the lonely space where I'd been slowly dying from systematic poisoning, it had become a gathering place for friends, volunteers, and families who needed support or advice. My kitchen table, where I'd once sat surrounded by medical documentation of my supposed decline, now hosted planning meetings for foundation projects and strategy sessions for helping other elderly abuse victims. Dr. Amanda Cross had continued monitoring my health, and her report showed that my recovery from 3 years of systematic poisoning was virtually complete. My cognitive function tested higher than the average for my age group, my physical health was excellent, and my energy levels were comparable to someone 10 years younger. "Eleanor," Dr. Cross told me during my most recent checkup, "medically speaking, you're healthier now than you were before Trevor and Vanessa started poisoning you. Whatever they intended to accomplish, they actually seem to have motivated you to become stronger and more vital than ever." As I reflected on the past year, I realized that Trevor and Vanessa's attempt to murder me had ultimately failed in ways they could never have anticipated. They'd tried to make me disappear, to erase me from existence so they could claim my assets without interference. Instead, they'd made me more visible, more influential, and more important to my community than I'd ever been before. Their calculated cruelty had inspired systematic compassion. Their systematic abuse had created systematic protection for vulnerable people. Their attempt to profit from my death had resulted in resources that would help other elderly people live safely and independently. Most importantly, their betrayal had taught me that the strongest human connections aren't based on obligation or expectation of gain, but on mutual respect, genuine care, and shared commitment to protecting each other from harm. The family they'd tried to destroy through manipulation and murder had been replaced by something stronger and more meaningful, a chosen community based on love rather than greed. On quiet evenings, when I sat in my garden watching the sunset and planning the next day's foundation work, I sometimes thought about Trevor and Vanessa in their prison cells, counting the years until their deaths behind bars. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but I felt profound gratitude that their attempt to end my story had instead given it new purpose and meaning. They'd gambled everything on the belief that elderly people were vulnerable, isolated, and disposable. They'd lost that bet completely, and their complete destruction had become the foundation for protecting countless other elderly people from similar predators. At 72, I was more alive, more engaged, and more optimistic about the future than I'd been in decades. The woman they'd tried to murder had become someone far more powerful than the person they'd originally targeted, and that transformation was going to outlast their memory by generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.